Welcome to Dark Screen Chronicles. Tonight, we invite you to close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the soothing sounds of rain guide you into a world beyond the ordinary. In the quiet darkness, strange and surreal tales unfold, stories that dance on the edge of reality, weaving through the unknown. As the rain falls softly around you, let your mind wander. Let go of the day's weight and drift into the whispers of the supernatural. Relax and remember, in the stillness of the night, not everything is as it seems. Lena had always been drawn to old houses, the way their creaking floorboards whispered secrets and memories from the past. It was a fascination that had started as a child, visiting her grandmother's house, a sprawling, decaying mansion in the woods. The way the house seemed to breathe, slow, steady, filled her with a strange comfort. But now, at 28, Lena was beginning to wonder if it wasn't the house that was breathing, but something else. It was on a rainy afternoon that she found the house, a decrepit thing at the edge of a small town, long abandoned, overgrown with vines and moss. The windows were clouded with dirt, the roof sagging as if it couldn't bear the weight of its own history. Lena didn't know what drew her in that day. She had no intention of staying long, but something inside the house called to her. The front door, stiff from years of disuse, creaked open with a gentle push. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of mildew. Sunlight filtered through the grimy windows, casting faint beams that barely illuminated the darkness. But Lena wasn't afraid. She was curious. The house felt familiar, as though it had been waiting for her. She wandered through the rooms, her footsteps muffled by the dust-covered floor. The walls were adorned with yellowing portraits, their eyes seeming to follow her every movement. But what unsettled her most were the sounds, the faint tapping, a scratching noise that came from beneath the floorboards. Lena paused, straining to hear. It was as though something was trying to make its way up through the wood, desperate to be free. She knelt down, her fingers brushing against the floor, and for a moment the noise stopped. A chill ran through her spine, but when she stood up, it started again. A soft tapping, then a low, rhythmic scratching. "Who's there?" she whispered, not really expecting an answer. The noise stopped abruptly. Then from beneath the floor came a voice, a whisper, soft and urgent. "Help me." Lena's breath caught in her throat. She backed away from the floorboards, her heart racing. The whisper had been clear, unmistakable. But who or what was it? She glanced around the room. There was no sign of anyone, no trace of life. It came again, this time louder. "Please, help me." Torn between fear and the same overwhelming curiosity that had led her into the house in the first place, Lena crouched down again, her hands trembling as she pressed against the floorboards. The scratching noise intensified, and for a moment it seemed as though the floor was going to crack open beneath her. But then, as if the house itself was taking a breath, everything fell still. She stood up, disoriented, unsure of what to do. The house was holding its breath. The silence was suffocating. And then, as she turned to leave, she noticed something, just out of the corner of her eye. A shadow flickered in one of the doorways at the far end of the hallway. Lena froze. There, in the dim light, stood a figure. A woman, tall and gaunt, dressed in old-fashioned clothing. Her hair hung in limp strands around her pale face, and her eyes were wide with terror. She didn't speak, but her mouth moved as if she was trying to say something. Then, with a shuddering breath, the woman collapsed to the floor with a soft thud. Lena rushed forward, her mind whirling with questions. She crouched beside the woman, her hand hovering just above her shoulder. But before she could touch her, the woman's eyes shot open, locking onto Lena's with an intensity that made her blood run cold. The woman's lips parted, and a guttural, choking sound emerged, a voice that was not her own. "They never left," the voice rasped. "They're still here, beneath the floor." Before Lena could react, the woman's body convulsed violently, and then, with a final, eerie gasp, she went limp in Lena's arms. Panic surged through Lena as she scrambled backward, her hands shaking as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. But the woman was gone, vanished, like smoke. The house was no longer silent. The whispering returned, louder this time, echoing through the walls. "Help us! Free us!" Lena ran from room to room, trying to find an escape, but the doors were locked, the windows sealed shut. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't break free. It was as if the house itself had become a trap. She could hear the scratching now, louder, more frantic, coming from every direction. From beneath the floor, from behind the walls, from the shadows. Desperately, Lena grabbed a rusted shovel from a forgotten corner of the house. She didn't know why. Perhaps she was just trying to escape, trying to fight back against the oppressive force that seemed to be closing in on her. But as she raised the shovel and struck the floorboards, something strange happened. The boards cracked open, not with the sound of wood splitting, but with a low, wet slurp. The air grew thick, and the shadows in the room twisted, writhing as if alive. And then, from the hole in the floor, something began to rise. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even human. It was something far worse. A black, tar-like substance began to spill from the cracks in the floor, pooling around her feet. The whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices, all pleading, all demanding to be freed. The tar surged forward, crawling up her legs, pulling her down into the darkness beneath the house. In that moment, Lena understood. The house wasn't haunted. It was the thing beneath the floor. The thing that had been waiting all these years, waiting for someone, anyone, to listen. But now, it was too late. As the tar consumed her, as her breath was suffocated by the thick, cloying blackness, Lena's last thought was a chilling realization. She was never meant to leave. And somewhere, far beneath the house, something whispered one last time. "Now, you are one of us." When Theo moved into the old townhouse on Elm Street, he didn't think much of the rumors about the place. He was just looking for a fresh start, somewhere quiet, away from the noise of the city. The house was cheap, the location serene, and there was something oddly charming about its faded elegance. But on his first night there, something strange happened. The house was quiet, too quiet. There was no sound of traffic outside, no distant hum of life, just the soft creak of the wooden floors and the rustling of old curtains in the wind. Theo had just finished unpacking and was sitting in the living room, sipping tea, when he heard it. Footsteps. At first, Theo thought it was just the house settling. But as the steps grew louder, methodical, deliberate, he froze. The sound was coming from the hallway, right outside his door. Slow, measured footsteps, as though someone was pacing back and forth in the dark. He stood up, his heart pounding, and walked cautiously to the hallway. There was no one there. He stood in the empty space, listening. The footsteps continued, echoing through the narrow hall. They sounded distant, as though they were coming from somewhere far below, deep in the foundation of the house. The floorboards creaked, the walls seemed to hum with energy, and the footsteps grew more persistent. Theo backed away slowly, trying to calm himself. Maybe it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, but the more he tried to dismiss the noise, the more it felt real. Too real. As the clock struck midnight, the footsteps stopped. The silence was unbearable, but just as Theo thought it was over, the footsteps began again, closer this time, right behind him. Theo spun around, his breath catching in his throat. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure. A man, his face hidden in shadow, his body motionless. He was tall, unnaturally still, but the echo of his footsteps still rang through the air. The man's presence was oppressive, like a weight pressing down on Theo's chest. Theo opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The figure stepped forward, and for the briefest moment, Theo could see his face, a hollowed, lifeless expression. The eyes were dark, empty pits staring directly at Theo. The air grew cold, and the echo of the footsteps reverberated in Theo's bones. With a sudden, violent motion, the figure lunged forward, vanishing into the dark hallway in an instant. Theo stood frozen, his mind racing. He didn't know if he had imagined it, or if the figure was real. But when he turned to leave, he heard the footsteps again, faint at first, but growing louder, closer, until they were right behind him. He ran, heart hammering in his chest, but no matter how fast he went, the footsteps followed, closer, faster, relentless. The air thickened with the weight of something terrible, something ancient, and Theo realized in a moment of stark clarity that the footsteps weren't just following him. They were part of him now. They had always been there. The townhouse was alive in a way Theo couldn't understand. It was as though the house itself had a pulse, a rhythm, an echo that had been waiting for him. And the footsteps, they were not just the sounds of someone walking. They were the footsteps of the house, of something far older, far darker than he could imagine. And they would never stop. Maggie always considered herself a practical person. She didn't believe in ghosts or anything otherworldly. When her friend had suggested they visit the old antique store on the edge of town, Maggie had rolled her eyes. Just some dusty junk, she had thought. But when she entered the store, something caught her eye. It was an antique mirror framed with ornate carvings, its glass dark and cloudy. At first, Maggie dismissed it as another forgotten relic of the past. But the longer she stared at it, the more it seemed to pull her in. The reflection was wrong. Not in a way that was immediately obvious, but subtle, distorted. The edges of her reflection seemed to ripple, as if the glass were alive. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with tired eyes, noticed her lingering gaze. "Ah, the mirror," he said softly. "It's quite special, you know. One of a kind, but I'd recommend you leave it be. Some things should stay hidden." Maggie smiled politely, brushing off his warning, but her curiosity had already been piqued. She didn't believe in superstitions, but something about the mirror felt different. She had to take it home. That evening, after Maggie had cleaned the house and settled in, she placed the mirror on the wall in her hallway. It felt out of place among the modern decor, its old-fashioned frame a stark contrast to the sleek furniture and minimalist designs. But she couldn't bring herself to move it. As she passed by the mirror, she glanced at her reflection. At first, everything seemed normal, but then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something shift. It wasn't her reflection, it was someone else, standing just behind her. Her heart skipped a beat, but when she turned around, there was no one there, just the empty hallway. Shrugging it off as exhaustion, Maggie continued her evening routine. But as the night wore on, the strange occurrences became impossible to ignore. Every time she passed the mirror, she saw the figure in the reflection. A shadowy form, tall and thin, standing in the exact same spot behind her. The figure never moved, never spoke, just stood there, its face hidden in darkness. The air around her seemed to grow colder, heavier. The house felt wrong, like it was pressing in on her, suffocating her. She could no longer ignore the fact that the reflection was not hers. Maggie's anxiety grew. She would try to avoid the mirror, but it was everywhere she went, its silent presence looming in the hallway. And then, one night, as she was heading to bed, she saw it again, the figure in the mirror. But this time it wasn't just standing behind her. It stepped forward, its face now visible. It wasn't a face at all. Where its eyes should have been, there were just hollow sockets, black voids that seemed to stretch into an endless darkness. Its mouth was a jagged, twisted line, as though someone had ripped it open with a blade. And its hands, long, spindly fingers, reached out from the glass, pressing against the surface, leaving behind a smear of cold, black ink. Maggie stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. She tried to look away, to move, but she couldn't. The reflection's hands pressed harder against the mirror, as if trying to break free. The dark figure seemed to smile, a slow, unnatural grin stretching across its face. With a surge of panic, Maggie rushed forward and yanked the mirror off the wall. It was heavier than it should have been, and the coldness emanating from the glass seemed to seep into her skin. But as she stared at the reflection once more, the figure wasn't in the mirror. It was behind her, right there in the room with her. Maggie spun around, but there was no one there, nothing but empty air. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she turned back to the mirror. The figure was gone, but the glass was no longer cloudy. It was clear, sharp, and flawless. The reflection that stared back at her was not hers. It was the dark figure. And then it spoke. "Let me out," it whispered, its voice hollow, echoing inside her skull. Terrified, Maggie hurled the mirror across the room, where it shattered against the floor. The glass splintered, but as it did, the figure's face seemed to laugh, its mouth stretching impossibly wide. The laughter reverberated in her ears, growing louder until it filled her entire mind. And then, silence. The next morning, Maggie woke up on the floor, surrounded by the broken pieces of the mirror. Her heart was still racing, but there was no sign of the figure. She tried to dismiss the events of the night as a bad dream, but when she stood up, she caught a glimpse of herself in the shards of glass scattered across the floor. And for a split second in the reflection, the figure's eyes met hers. It was still there, waiting. Ever since Max had moved into the old farmhouse at the edge of town, something had felt off. It wasn't the house itself, though. The old timber beams, the large open spaces, it was everything Max had dreamed of. But there was something hidden, something that whispered to him at night, when the world was still and the shadows stretched long across the walls. It all started with the stairs. The farmhouse had a winding staircase, the kind that creaked and groaned with age. But it wasn't the noise that bothered Max. It was what lay beneath the stairs, an odd space, half hidden by a worn curtain, sealed off from the rest of the house. It was small, cramped, with no real purpose other than to be there. Max had never thought much about it until one evening, when the light in the hallway flickered, and he saw something out of the corner of his eye. For just a moment, a figure stood in the small, dark space beneath the stairs, too quick to catch fully, but enough to make his heart race. The next day, he tried to dismiss it, attributing it to fatigue. But the next night, the figure returned. This time, Max stood frozen in place, watching as the shadow stretched longer across the floor. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. It was something else, something that slithered. The figure inched its way closer to the stairs, moving in unnatural ways, twisting as if its joints were wrong. It seemed to reach for him, beckoning. Max tried to call out, but his voice was lost in the air. His body felt heavy, rooted to the spot. When the shadow fully reached the stairs, it paused, and Max could hear a low, guttural whisper, like a voice coming from beneath the earth itself. "Come closer," it whispered, so faint that he wasn't sure if he had heard it at all. But there was no denying the feeling in his chest, the pull, the compulsion. He had to know what was beneath those stairs. That night, Max couldn't resist. He grabbed a flashlight and made his way to the dark corner. The curtain hung loosely, and as his hand brushed it aside, the room beneath the stairs was revealed in full. It was smaller than it seemed from the outside, just a small, narrow space, with dust hanging in the air, and nothing more than a wooden floor covered in rotting debris. But there was something else, a door. Max hadn't noticed it before, hidden behind layers of filth and webs. It was old, made of dark wood, with iron hinges that looked far too old to be from this house. The air around it felt thick, unnatural, and the whispering, the low murmurs, seemed to rise from beneath it, calling him closer. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached out to touch the door. It was cold to the touch, colder than anything he had ever felt. His fingers tingled, a sharp, prickling sensation that made his skin crawl. When he turned the handle, it opened with an unnerving creak. Behind the door was a stairway, narrow and steep, winding downward into darkness. No light reached into the depths, no sound could be heard from below, but the feeling of something waiting beneath was undeniable. Max stepped forward, and the moment his foot touched the first step, the whispering grew louder. "Come closer. Come to us," the voice hissed. Compelled, Max descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The walls felt alive, pulsating with the rhythm of his own heartbeat, the whispers surrounding him like a shroud. He tried to turn back, but his body refused to obey. He had to go further. He had to know. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened up into a cavernous room, a large, dark chamber with no windows, no doors, no escape. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the stone. At the center of the room stood a massive, ancient stone altar, its surface slick with something wet and black. And then Max saw them. Eyes, dozens of eyes, staring at him from the shadows. Their glowing irises reflected the light of his flashlight, but they were not the eyes of any creature he had ever seen. They were too many, too large, too alive. They moved, shifting around him, the eyes crawling across the walls, the floor, even the air itself. Max tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the heavy silence of the chamber. A low, rasping laugh echoed from the shadows, and the whispers returned, now 1,000 voices all speaking at once. "You found us!" Suddenly, the eyes converged. They swarmed towards Max, closing in from all sides, their movements quick and fluid. Max tried to run, but it was like his legs were trapped in place, as if the very air had turned to stone. The eyes touched him, their cold, sticky gaze seeping into his skin. The whispers became a deafening roar, filling his mind with fragments of thoughts, memories, and something else. A presence, ancient and hungry, filling every corner of his consciousness. Max couldn't fight it. He was pulled deeper into the darkness, his body sinking into the cold stone floor, until there was nothing left but the whispers. And in the silence that followed, beneath the stairs, the house waited for the next person. When Lucas moved into the old, secluded cottage in the countryside, he didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. The house had been empty for years, the garden overgrown and wild, but the place had a certain charm to it, a quiet, forgotten beauty. The rent was cheap and the peaceful surroundings were exactly what he needed after years of city life. But there was one thing about the garden that unsettled him. The entrance to the garden was hidden behind a thick tangle of vines, almost like the house was trying to keep it secret. Lucas had tried to trim the vines back, but every time he cut them, they seemed to grow back thicker, faster, as if something was encouraging them to take over. One day, as he was pulling weeds near the house, he noticed something strange among the vines, a small, weathered gate, almost entirely obscured by the thick foliage. The gate was old, its metal rusted and twisted, but there was something about it that called to him. Without thinking, Lucas pushed the gate open. The hinges groaned, and the moment it swung wide, a rush of cold air hit him, like the breath of something ancient. He stepped inside, finding himself in a garden unlike any he had ever seen. The flowers were beautiful, vibrant in colors that didn't seem natural. Blues deeper than the sky, reds brighter than fire. The trees were tall and twisted, their bark dark and slick like oil. But the strangest thing was the silence. There were no birds, no insects, no rustling leaves. The air was still, unnaturally still, as though time itself had forgotten this place. As he wandered deeper into the garden, Lucas felt a strange pull, as if the plants were beckoning him. He could feel their eyes on him, though they had none. The flowers seemed to sway toward him, reaching out as if they wanted something from him. But it wasn't until he reached the center of the garden that the true horror revealed itself. There, in the heart of the garden, was a stone well, ancient and covered in moss, but still intact. The well was surrounded by a ring of twisted, black flowers, their petals curled like the fingers of a dead hand. Lucas stood over the well, peering down into its depths. But there was no water, no dark, silent pool, just darkness, a deep, consuming void. And from the bottom of the well he could hear a faint whisper. "Help. Help me." He leaned in closer, straining to hear. The whisper grew louder, more desperate. It was a voice, soft and pleading, but unmistakably human. His heart raced as he leaned farther, almost close enough to fall in. The voice called again, the words dragging through his mind like nails on glass. "Please, please, I've been waiting so long." Without thinking, Lucas grabbed the rope hanging beside the well and began to lower himself down into the darkness. The further he went, the colder the air became, the whispers growing louder and more frantic. They weren't just one voice anymore. They were dozens, hundreds, all calling to him, pulling him deeper. He reached the bottom and found himself standing on cold stone, surrounded by complete darkness. But then something moved. A figure crawling out from the shadows, its form shifting and changing like smoke. It reached out with long, gnarled fingers, the fingers of 1,000 twisted hands, its face a blur of eyes and mouths that never stopped moving. And then it spoke. "You should not have come here." The voice was all around him now, echoing in every direction. Lucas turned to run, but the walls of the well seemed to close in, shifting and changing as though they had a will of their own. The garden above him began to twist, its flowers growing sharper, more sinister, their petals now like jagged teeth, ready to bite. The whispers filled his ears, and he could feel them pulling at him, trying to drag him into the depths. He scrambled for the rope, but it had vanished. The walls began to crumble, and in their place something far worse began to rise, something ancient and hungry, its tendrils reaching out to claim him. With a final scream, Lucas tried to escape, but the darkness swallowed him whole, and the well's mouth closed behind him, sealing him in. From above, the garden grew silent again, as it had before, and the gate behind him, the one he had opened so easily, slowly began to close. Elena had always been drawn to the old house. It had been passed down through generations, standing at the edge of town, its walls weathered but still sturdy. Her grandmother had lived there, and her great-grandmother before that. Each time Elena visited as a child, she would hear stories about the house, stories that didn't make sense then but seemed much darker as she grew older. Now, as an adult, Elena found herself inheriting the house. It was hers, with no one else to claim it. So she moved in, eager to start fresh and perhaps uncover the hidden history of the family home. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of stillness that settled into the bones, making the air feel thick, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Elena tried to ignore it, telling herself that the eerie silence was just a product of living alone. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the darkness crept in, Elena decided to explore the attic. She'd always been told not to go up there, that it was best left undisturbed. But curiosity got the best of her. She climbed the narrow staircase that led to the attic, the wooden steps creaking under her weight. The door at the top was old, the paint chipped, and as she pushed it open, a musty smell hit her, a mix of old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic. She flicked on the light, and the dim bulb cast long shadows across the room. The attic was filled with old furniture, crates and boxes, relics of generations past. But there, in the far corner, was something that caught her attention. A tall, black wardrobe, out of place among the clutter, its surface polished and pristine, as if it had just been placed there. Elena felt a strange chill crawl up her spine. She couldn't explain it, but the wardrobe seemed wrong, like it had been waiting for her. Against her better judgment, Elena walked over to the wardrobe and ran her hand over the smooth wood. The moment her fingers brushed the surface, the temperature in the room dropped. She pulled her hand back, heart racing. She didn't know why, but she had to open it. The doors creaked open, revealing the darkness inside. No clothes, no old family heirlooms. Just empty space, stretching far deeper than the wardrobe should have allowed. A hollow void. Suddenly, the air grew thick, and Elena heard a faint whisper, low and guttural, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the wardrobe. "Come closer." Elena froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was not human. It was something ancient, something that had been locked away for far too long. Her hand moved on its own accord, reaching out toward the dark, black space inside the wardrobe. Her fingers brushed against the cold interior, and the darkness rippled like liquid. She jerked her hand back, but something was different. The shadows inside the wardrobe seemed to have shifted. They moved as if alive, swirling around her wrist like fingers, grasping, tugging. In a panic, Elena tried to pull away, but the shadows tightened, pulling her closer, dragging her toward the wardrobe. Her body was weightless, as though the very air was trying to consume her. She screamed, her voice echoing through the attic, but no one could hear her. There was no escape. Then, in an instant, everything stopped. The shadows released her, and the wardrobe doors slammed shut, trapping whatever had been inside. Elena collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the silence in the attic returned, heavier than before. The wardrobe was just a wardrobe again, ordinary in every way. But Elena knew the truth. The shadows had been waiting for her, waiting for someone to open the door. And somewhere in the depths of the attic, the voice was still whispering, waiting for her to come back. Mira had always loved the quiet of her small, secluded apartment. It was tucked away in an old building at the edge of the city, where the streets were quieter, the neighbors more distant. She had recently moved in, finding solace in the stillness after a difficult breakup. It was the perfect place to start over, to forget the noise of her past and create a life of her own. But there was one thing about the apartment that unsettled her. Every night, without fail, at precisely 3:33 a.m., the clock on the wall would begin to tick loudly. At first, Mira thought it was just the normal noises of the old building, creaks, groans, and the occasional rattle of pipes. But over time, the sound grew more persistent, more rhythmic, like a ticking clock that refused to stop. It wasn't the sound that bothered her. It was what happened after the ticking stopped. Each time the clock hit 3:33 a.m., Mira would find herself wide awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to move or make a sound. Her body would feel as though it were paralyzed, like invisible hands were holding her down. In the dark silence that followed the ticking, she would feel something else, in the room with her. It was a presence, a weight, pressing against the air, something watching, waiting. And then, at the stroke of 3:34 a.m., the sensation would vanish, and she could move again, her body returning to normal. But the unease lingered. One night, exhausted from the constant disruptions, Mira decided she would confront whatever it was. She sat up in bed, eyes fixed on the clock. As the hands inched closer to 3:33 a.m., her heart began to race. She would stay awake this time. She would see what happened. The clock struck 3:33, and immediately the paralysis took hold. Mira's body stiffened, her breath shallow and rapid. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock, louder now, almost deafening. Then she felt it, the cold, creeping sensation of something moving near her, a shadow, a presence. She couldn't tell. Her mind raced. What was it? Was it a dream? A hallucination? And then, from the corner of the room, she saw it. A figure, tall, thin, and featureless, like a silhouette of pure darkness. It was standing still, watching her with invisible eyes. Its shape flickered in and out of focus, like it was unsure of its own form. It didn't move, but she could feel its attention. It was aware of her, and as the seconds ticked by, Mira realized something terrifying. The figure wasn't just watching her, it was waiting for something. The clock chimed again, louder now, and for the first time Mira could feel the floor beneath her trembling. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky, unnatural, like something from a nightmare. When it was just inches away from her face, it whispered, its voice a distorted echo in her mind. "You were supposed to stay asleep." The words didn't make sense, but the fear coursing through her body made her blood run cold. She wanted to scream, to move, to do anything, but the paralysis wouldn't let her. The figure leaned in closer, its presence now suffocating. "You shouldn't have woken up," it repeated, its voice growing louder, more distorted. "Now you're a part of it." The room began to spin, and the air turned thick, heavy with dread. The figure's form stretched, distorted, until it was no longer human, just a black mass of shifting shadows swirling around her, consuming the light. The clock's ticking grew faster, louder, more frantic. Mira's vision blurred as the shadows closed in. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the room went silent. The clock stopped, the shadows vanished, and Mira was alone again, her body released from the grip of the paralysis. She blinked, disoriented, trying to shake the lingering feeling of terror. The clock on the wall read 3:35 a.m. Just 2 minutes had passed, but it felt like hours. The next morning, Mira packed up her things, every bit of her mind screaming that she needed to leave. She couldn't stay in the apartment anymore, not with whatever that was lurking in the darkness. But when she tried to leave, she found the door wouldn't open. Her heart raced. The door was locked, but not from the outside, from within. As she turned to face the room behind her, she realized the truth. The apartment, the building, the clock. It wasn't just her home. It was a place, a space, trapped in its own endless loop of time, always waiting for the next person to cross its threshold, always waiting for someone to wake up. And she had just woken up. Laura had always been fascinated by old things. She had a collection of antiques, vintage furniture, books that smelled of dust and age, and mirrors that reflected more than just her image. She believed they held history, stories waiting to be told. So, when she found the large ornate mirror at a small antique shop, she knew it had to be hers. It was framed in dark wood, intricately carved with swirling designs, and the glass shimmered in a way that seemed almost unnatural. The shopkeeper had warned her, though, with a serious look in his eyes. "That mirror, it's best left untouched. It has a history you won't want to know." Laura, with her usual curiosity, laughed it off. "Old mirrors always have stories," she said with a grin, paying for the item and taking it home. The first few days were uneventful. The mirror hung on the wall in her living room, reflecting the quiet of her home. She admired it, sometimes catching herself staring into the glass for longer than she should, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. That was until one night. It was late and Laura was alone, settling into bed when she heard something. A faint scratching sound, like fingernails on glass, came from the living room. At first, she dismissed it as nothing, a trick of the wind, perhaps, but the noise grew louder, more insistent, as though something inside the mirror was trying to get out. Curiosity got the best of her again. She got up from bed, her feet cold on the floor, and walked into the living room. The scratching stopped as soon as she stepped inside. The mirror, reflecting the soft light of the room, seemed still, too still. Lara approached it, her reflection staring back at her, calm and quiet. But then something caught her eye. Her reflection was moving. It wasn't an obvious shift, not at first. It was small. Her reflection blinked a little too slowly. The corner of her mouth twitched just slightly in a way she hadn't. But then it grew, more noticeable. Her reflection was mimicking her every move, but there was a delay. It seemed to be watching her, studying her, as if waiting for her to make the next move. Suddenly, Lara's reflection did something it wasn't supposed to. It smiled, a wide, unsettling grin that stretched impossibly far, its eyes gleaming with a hunger that was not her own. Lara froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a step back. The reflection didn't move. "Stop it," she whispered to herself, but the reflection just smiled wider, its eyes never leaving hers. She turned away, desperate to shake the feeling of the reflection's cold stare, but when she glanced back at the mirror, she saw something else. Her reflection was no longer just mimicking her. It was moving on its own. The smile faded, and the reflection began to raise its hand slowly, reaching out from the glass. Lara stood paralyzed in fear as the hand grew closer, reaching toward her, the fingers curling like claws. "No," Lara whispered, but she couldn't move. The reflection's hand was inches from the glass now, and then it touched the mirror. A loud, violent crack echoed through the room. The glass shattered, but Lara didn't feel any shards cut into her skin. Instead, the air grew cold, and the shattered mirror no longer reflected her. It reflected something else. A figure, taller than her, stepped out from the broken glass. It was her reflection, but twisted and wrong. It moved with an unnatural grace, its body stretching and distorting, the smile never leaving its face. The eyes were not her own, black, empty voids, and they glowed with a strange, sickly light. Lara tried to scream, but no sound came out. She stumbled backward, her legs giving way beneath her, but the figure just moved closer, its hand outstretched, the sharp, broken edges of the mirror now embedded in its flesh. Yet it didn't bleed. "You shouldn't have looked so long," the reflection whispered, its voice a distorted version of her own. "Now you're mine." The figure lunged at her, and everything went black. The next morning, Lara's apartment was quiet. The broken mirror lay in pieces on the floor, but there was no sign of Lara. No sign of anything out of place, except for the lingering crack in the glass. If anyone were to look into the mirror now, they would see only a quiet, empty room. But somewhere, hidden in the reflection, Lara could still be seen, staring back at anyone who dared to look, her face stretched into that same unnerving smile. Elliot was no stranger to the late-night train rides. He worked a job with strange hours, and most nights he found himself on the last train back to his apartment. The train was always nearly empty at that hour, just a few tired passengers scattered across the carriages, their faces dimly lit by the flickering lights above. But tonight was different. It was just after midnight when Elliot boarded the train, exhausted from a long shift. The platform was nearly deserted, the air cold and damp, a light mist hanging in the air. He shuffled into the nearest car, his mind still wrapped in the fog of his workday, and took a seat by the window. The train doors closed with a low, mechanical hiss, and the car jerked into motion. Elliot stared out the window, watching the city blur past, the lights of the buildings fading into the darkness. The rhythmic sound of the train wheels on the track was oddly soothing, and before long his eyelids began to droop. But as he drifted off to sleep, he heard something strange, a low whispering, soft and unintelligible. He blinked awake, his eyes scanning the empty train car. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving only the hum of the train. He shook his head, dismissing it as his imagination, and closed his eyes again. But the whispering came back, this time louder, more insistent, like voices rising in urgency. He opened his eyes once more, and his heart skipped a beat. The car was no longer empty. There were people sitting in the seats across from him, but not like normal passengers. Their faces were obscured by shadows, their heads lowered as though they were deep in thought, their bodies unnaturally still. Elliot could feel his pulse quicken as his gaze swept across them. But there was something else, something wrong. One of them lifted their head slowly, revealing their face. But it wasn't a face at all. It was a pale, featureless mask, smooth and white with no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just an empty surface that gleamed in the dim light. The mask seemed to stare straight at him, and Elliot's breath caught in his throat. He turned away quickly, his hands gripping the armrest. This couldn't be real. He had to be dreaming. The train was just tired, he thought, and he had worked too much. But then the whispering started again, louder this time, almost a chant. Get off, get off, get off. He looked around, but the other passengers hadn't moved. They were still seated, their heads tilted in unison, their faces turned toward him. The words grew more frantic, the voices overlapping in a strange chorus that filled the entire car. Get off, Elliot. Get off. The train was slowing now, the lights flickering as it approached the next station. Elliot's mind raced, his heart thumping in his chest. He stood up, backing toward the door, but the figure with the mask, the one that had stared at him, was now standing in front of him, blocking the exit. You can't leave, the figure said, its voice like a dry whisper. The train won't let you. Elliot tried to push past it, his panic rising, but the figure's hand shot out and gripped his arm with an unnatural strength. He gasped, the coldness of its touch seeping into his skin. The train was now stationary, the doors sealed shut, and as Elliot looked out the window, he realized something horrifying. The station outside was dark, empty. There were no lights, no signs, no people waiting. Just an endless stretch of tracks leading into the void. He turned back to the figure, his chest tight with fear, but the creature was no longer there. The entire train car was empty once more, the passengers gone, the air heavy with an unnatural silence. He yanked at the door, but it wouldn't open. The whispering voices were growing louder now, a maddening chorus of demands until the lights went out. Complete darkness enveloped him, the train car now eerily still, but for the soft, steady hum of the engine. He felt his heart race, the air thick with an unseen presence. And then a final voice broke through, cold and mocking. This is your stop, Elliot. The train lurched forward with a sudden jolt, and as Elliot's feet were swept from beneath him, he fell into the darkness, pulled away from the train, from the world. was the second day of moving into her new house when Rachel first heard the sound. At first, it was faint, like a soft scratching beneath the floorboards, almost imperceptible. She thought it might be rats or some other animal getting into the house. The old house creaked and groaned in places, after all, and she had grown used to the odd noises that came with age. But as the days went on, the sound grew louder. It wasn't just scratching anymore. It became knocking, then tapping, a rhythmic sound that pulsed through the house like a heartbeat. Rachel tried to ignore it at first, convincing herself it was just the house settling, old wood shifting in the dark. But when she was in the kitchen one evening, standing near the center of the room, she heard something different, something unmistakable. It was a voice, a whisper, soft and almost too quiet to catch, coming from beneath the floorboards. "Help me." Rachel froze, her blood running cold. She thought she had imagined it at first, but then it came again, this time louder, more desperate. "Help me, please." She rushed to the floor, kneeling down and placing her ear close to the boards. The voice was faint, but it was there, coming from deep within the house. It was a child's voice, soft and trembling, as if it were calling out from a great distance. Rachel stood up, heart pounding, and walked to the living room, trying to shake the feeling of dread that washed over her. She paced back and forth, thinking it was nothing more than an odd sound. Maybe the pipes? Maybe just the wind? But as the days passed, the voice never stopped. It came every night, always around midnight, like clockwork, a soft, haunting whisper. Finally, unable to take it anymore, Rachel decided to investigate. She called the carpenter and asked him to come over and lift a few of the floorboards. He was skeptical, of course, but agreed to help. The moment the floorboard was lifted, Rachel peered into the darkness below. It was just an empty crawl space, full of dust and old, discarded furniture. Nothing unusual. Nothing except for the faint traces of a torn piece of fabric, tangled and weathered, lying on the floor. Then Rachel heard it again. The whisper. It was louder now, more urgent. "It's too late." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She turned to the carpenter, but he was standing still, staring down into the space, his face pale. He looked at her, his eyes wide in fear. "You need to leave," he said, his voice shaking. "There's something wrong with this house, something wrong beneath it." Rachel was about to ask him what he meant when she heard something else, a sound, something moving beneath the floor. She turned back, her body frozen in place as a low growl rose from the darkness below. "Help me, please," the voice cried out again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a scream, a tortured, hollow scream that filled the room. Before Rachel could react, the ground beneath her feet cracked open. The floorboards splintered and broke apart, a dark shape emerging from the shadows beneath. A small, twisted figure, pale, gaunt, and covered in dark, wet cloth, crawled out from the darkness, its eyes wide with terror. It reached up toward her, its fingers elongated and sharp, like claws. "I never wanted this," it whispered, its voice warped and broken. "But now you're part of it." Rachel stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest as the figure lunged toward her. But just as quickly, the darkness swallowed it whole, pulling it back beneath the floor with a violent, gut-wrenching force. The carpenter grabbed her arm and yanked her toward the door. They ran out of the house as the floorboards cracked and groaned, as though the house itself was alive and angry. The voice echoed behind them, fading into the distance, but the cold chill in the air remained. Rachel never returned to that house, and though she tried to forget, The whispers followed her, lingering in the shadows, always waiting for the next person to hear them. And the house stood there, silent but hungry for the next soul to come too close. When Emily found the old photograph at the estate sale, it seemed like just another piece of junk. It was a black and white photo, the edges frayed with age, tucked between some faded letters and a stack of forgotten knickknacks. The photo was of a man standing alone in a park, dressed in a suit from another time, early 1900s maybe. His expression was stern, almost unsettling, and his eyes seemed to follow her as she looked at it. She didn't think much of it at first, just another old picture, maybe something with a little historical value. She bought it for a few dollars, intending to hang it up in her apartment. Something about it intrigued her, though. The way the man's eyes seemed so alive even in the old photograph. When Emily got home, she placed the photo on the mantel, and that was when things started to feel strange. The first night after the photo was hung, she awoke to the sound of soft scratching coming from the living room. At first, she thought it was just the house settling. But when she went to check, she saw nothing out of the ordinary, aside from the faint glow of the lamp reflecting off the photograph. The man's eyes seemed to shimmer in the light, almost as if he was staring at her. She laughed it off, but every night after that, the scratching continued. It was subtle at first, just a faint sound from somewhere behind the photo. But as the days went by, the sound grew louder, more persistent. She started to feel like the walls of the apartment were closing in on her, the noise echoing through the silence. One night, unable to sleep, she got up and walked into the living room. The scratching was louder than ever, and she could feel a strange, heavy presence in the air. The photo, once framed neatly on the mantel, was now crooked, as though someone or something had moved it. Her heart raced, her pulse quickened, and she reached for the photo, her hands trembling as she straightened it. That's when she noticed something chilling. The man's face, his expression, had changed. At first, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her, but the more she looked, the more she realized that his eyes were no longer just following her. They were watching her with a sinister intent. The stern look had turned into a twisted smile, a slow, deliberate grin that stretched unnaturally wide, as if his face could not contain it. His eyes gleamed with a deep, almost unnatural darkness, and the more she stared, the more she felt a chill crawl up her spine. The scratching sound grew louder, almost deafening now, as though something was clawing its way from behind the walls. Suddenly, the man in the photograph moved. Emily stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. The man's hand, once firmly by his side, had slowly raised, and now he was reaching toward the glass of the frame. His fingers pressed against it, his face contorted with that eerie smile, and the sound of his hand dragging against the glass sent a wave of nausea through her. She tried to rip the photo from the mantel, but the frame felt impossibly heavy in her hands, as though it was rooted to the wall. Panicking, she pulled harder, desperate to escape the photo's grip, but the man's hand pressed harder against the glass, his fingers warping and distorting, as though he were pushing against the very fabric of reality. And then, as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The photo was still, the man's expression frozen once more in that unsettling smile. Emily's breathing slowed, and the weight of the room seemed to lift. She thought it was over, that the nightmare was finished. But when she glanced at the photo one last time, her blood ran cold. There, beneath the man's smile, was a new figure, her own reflection. She hadn't been standing in front of the photo. She hadn't even been near it. But now, in the frame, her face was there, staring back at her with wide, terrified eyes, her mouth open in a silent scream. She reached out, but as her fingers brushed the glass, the reflection of her own hand reached out too, from within the photo. Emily ran. She didn't stop until she was outside, the photo still hanging in her apartment, the man's eyes watching from behind the glass. The next day, the apartment was empty. No sign of Emily, no trace of the photo, just a blank mantel where it once hung. The landlord tried to remember if anyone had ever lived there before, but there were no records, just the empty apartment, waiting for the next person to move in. And when they did, the photograph would be there, waiting for its new owner. Always watching, always waiting. Megan had always loved the quiet of her apartment, the stillness that came with living alone. It was peaceful, comforting, a sanctuary from the chaos of the outside world. She had lived there for nearly 2 years without incident, until she noticed it. At first, it was subtle, just a strange feeling when she walked past the door of the guest room. It wasn't her imagination. Something felt off about it, a lingering presence like someone was watching her. But when she'd glance inside, the room was always empty, as it should be. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting there, just out of sight. Megan tried to brush it off, but over time, the feeling grew stronger. She began to notice odd things, small, inexplicable details. A chair in the guest room would sometimes be moved slightly, as if someone had just left it. The air would grow cold when she entered, sending a shiver up her spine. Once, she even swore she heard footsteps behind her when she was in the hallway, but when she turned around, there was nothing. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Megan sat on the couch, exhausted. She was scrolling through her phone when she heard it, a soft scratching sound like fingernails running down wood. She froze, her blood turning to ice. It was coming from the guest room. She slowly stood up, her heart racing. The scratching continued, rhythmic and persistent. She felt a lump form in her throat as she approached the door. The air around it was thick, oppressive. With a trembling hand, Megan reached for the doorknob. As soon as her hand touched it, the scratching stopped. Complete silence. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She hesitated for a moment before slowly turning the knob and pushing the door open. Inside, everything appeared normal. The room was dark, save for the dim light spilling in from the hallway, casting long shadows across the floor. The bed was neatly made. The chair was exactly where it should be. Nothing seemed out of place. But as her eyes swept across the room, they landed on the corner by the closet. There, standing perfectly still in the shadows, was a figure. Its outline was faint, but there was no mistaking it. A shadow, tall and thin, with elongated limbs and a head that was just slightly too large. It was unnaturally still, almost like it was waiting. Megan's breath caught in her throat. She tried to step back, but her feet felt glued to the floor. The figure didn't move, but she could feel its eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, staring directly at her. Leave. The whisper was barely audible, but it cut through the air like a knife. Megan couldn't tell if the voice was coming from the figure or from somewhere deeper within the room. It was a command, a warning, and it chilled her to the bone. But she couldn't leave. She felt trapped, like her body wasn't her own. The door behind her slammed shut, and the figure stepped forward slowly, its movements jerky and unnatural. The shadows seemed to cling to it, wrapping around its limbs like they were part of it. "You shouldn't have come in," it whispered again, this time closer, its voice raspy and unnatural, like it hadn't been used in years. Megan's pulse hammered in her chest. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. Suddenly, the figure lunged toward her. She gasped, stumbling backward, but her feet caught on the floor, and she fell hard onto the ground. The figure loomed above her now, its face hidden in the shadows, but its presence was overwhelming. The room grew colder, the air thick with dread. "You should have stayed away," the voice murmured, a dark laugh following it. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the shadows. Megan lay there, panting, too terrified to move. She glanced around the room, but it was empty. The cold air began to dissipate, the normal silence returning. The door creaked open, and Megan scrambled to her feet. She didn't dare look back as she hurried out of the room, slamming the door behind her. That night, she left the apartment for good, never looking back. But to this day, when she walks past any door, she still feels it, the presence, waiting for her to enter. The shadows seem to stretch longer, and she can never shake the feeling that something is always just behind the door, watching, waiting for the moment she opens it again.